Slowing down pig growth, that's our topic this morning. Again, we're living in very unprecedented times right now. So understand that these different options and things that we're going to talk about are largely, things that we haven't done, certainly on a commercial basis. And so we're using our best estimates. We're using what we can draw from for information, but that is fairly limited, and it's going to be something that we kind of learn as we go also. But I do think we have some options that we can look at, specifically options we can do with how we manipulate the diet, do some nutritional interventions, as well as some other options we can do with our environmental management that we can help slow down pig growth. And really, what we're probably looking at is a combination of a few different options in most scenarios to try to provide the best option to, again, slow down pig growth. We're not going to be able to completely stop pig growth by any means. I think a likely hope would be that we would slow pig growth down by maybe.
Box you should leave out somewhere.
Sounds like we have somebody on the line. We have a chance to mute that line.
Yes, I will. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. The beauties of these technologies. So anyways, I think we can, what I was going to say was our expectations should be that we're going to try to maybe slow down pig growth by maybe a quarter to a third, probably not being able to slow down growth much more than at most maybe 50%, because we're going to have some real challenges, and there's some issues and concerns regarding animal welfare. So, and at the same standpoint, we need to be able to do this in an economic manner. Of course, markets are not very favorable now, and so really what we're trying to do is minimize losses in this case. So again, caution with any and all of these items that we're going to talk about. Biggest thing is really animal welfare and well-being. Anytime we stress pigs, particularly the genetics that we have today, these high lean growth animals we have, they are very much more sensitive to stress, and they tend to exacerbate that through increases in tail biting and flank biting. So anything that we do, we're going to have to really increase our observation of these animals and try to take other secondary measures to reduce or minimize these negative aspects, which quite frankly will most likely involve considerable tail biting. We also need to, of course, make sure that when we're doing these things, we keep in mind how it also impacts our production costs and other things such as carcass and meat quality and composition. We're really looking at it being a short-term type of scenario. This is something that we try to carry on for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. It's not something that we're going to be able to do with a group of pigs for a month and a half without having some serious and significant animal welfare concerns again, and just some very challenging issues with management. So, so if you're thinking about doing any of these things, we really strongly advise you to communicate with us, your Formafeed sales team, work with us, because we want to make sure that we're doing everything from a production management as well as nutritional standpoint to make the set of options that you're using work to the best of its ability. So I'll start out with a couple of items that I think are really the low-hanging fruit, or in other words, they're really those options that are relatively easy to implement, and they should have the least impact on our overall feed cost. Actually, when you look at diet costs just on a per ton basis, certainly they'll be reducing those diet costs, but overall on the impact on production costs, hopefully having the least amount of impact that way. And the first one would be, of course, to remove any growth promotants that we're currently using in the diets. Of course, these growth promotants, we're using those to normally increase growth rate, and since the purpose of us in this scenario would be to minimize growth rate, we're not wanting to use those products for those reasons. And of course, there's a cost there that we're going to be saving just on a dollars per ton basis. But realize that we've got some other positives that we typically get from some of these growth promotants. Could be feed conversion, could be carcass yield, some of both. Those kinds of things that we need to consider, because we're going to negatively impact those items also when we remove the growth promotants. Another item that I think is something that should be strongly considered is if you're using a fair amount of fat in your diets, it might be a time to consider either significantly reducing or completely removing those fats. You know, we normally use fat to increase the energy density of the diet, and it's especially helpful when we look at hot weather in the summer, in that we're able to partially mitigate the negative impact of hot weather on pig growth. During heat and stress, pigs will decrease their feed intake. It's their physiological mechanism to reduce the amount of heat stress on them, because there's a fair amount of heat that's given off during the metabolism and the digestion of feed. And so when we use fat releases less heat, and it's also more energy density. So we're trying to at least partially make up in growth some of that's lost during heat. Well, of course, if we're trying to decrease growth rate, we don't need to be trying to pull in that extra growth, particularly in stress situations. And additionally, we're probably looking at trying to reduce caloric density in the diet versus increase. And when we look at the cost of calories, typically it's much more expensive to provide those calories by fat versus providing them from a carbohydrate source such as grains, which is where most of our energy generally comes from. So it's a cost savings there. So we, our goal again, if we're wanting to decrease average daily gain, we can do that to some level by removing fat and reducing that energy concentration, and hopefully contributing towards reducing overall energy intake in the pig, which would then reflect on growth rate. So, but keep in mind, certainly as much as any item here, we're going to have a negative impact on our feed conversion, of course. Kind of a rule of thumb is that for every 1% of fat that we have in the diet, we improve our feed conversion by about 0.04. So if we have 60 pounds of fat per ton in the diet right now, and if we remove those 60 pounds of fat, we are going to increase our feed to gain ratio probably by about somewhere between 0.1 and 0.15, in that 0.12, 0.13 range. So obviously on that end of things, that increases our production costs there. So that needs to be considered as part of the equation also. Another option that we typically will look at and emphasize quite a bit in this kind of scenario is that we increase the bulk density of our diets. Here, the thinking is that we want to decrease the energy density to a point that the pig can't compensate by increasing its feed intake. Pigs will tend to eat to their energy needs within what's physically able. So when we add fat to the diets, pigs will actually decrease intake some because you have a higher energy density in the diet, but they essentially end up with the same amount of energy consumption on a daily basis overall. With fiber, we're doing the opposite. We're decreasing that energy basis. The pig to a point will compensate by increasing intake. But if we can increase the bulk density of the diets enough to where the pig can't compensate just because of physical limitations, then we can effectively reduce overall energy intake of that pig on a daily basis, and thus reduce growth rate. And we can reduce growth rate by 5 to 10% or even more. But we need to have enough fiber in the diet so that we're overcoming that. So, if we're looking at a normal corn soy diet, That's typically neutral detergent fiber, or NDF, is going to be right around 9% in those diets. We really need to probably double that at least in the diet in order to start seeing substantial decreases in overall energy intake in the pig. So we need at least 18% NDF. I'd prefer to see 20% NDF, and with 20% NDF, I'd expect to see a reduction of 10% or so average daily gain in pigs. So the challenge here, and what's really the challenge today, is the cost and availability of ingredients that we would normally be able to utilize for increasing bulk density of the diets. It has become a big challenge. Distillers grains, for instance, we've had low oil prices, which has been reflected at the gas stations, and it's been tough for the ethanol industry, and so we've seen some ethanol plants close down production, which has limited the supply of distillers grains some, and of course has increased the cost of those substantially. Otherwise, distillers grains, is normally a very good option to go with. Soybean hulls are a very effective way also to decrease energy density, but we've seen the availability of those decrease quite a bit and cost increase also the last week or two, probably in relationship to what's been going on with the distillers grains, and then also overall concerns of needing to be able to slow down pig growth. Wheat midds can be another excellent source. Corn germ meal, just some options there. But again, cost now, if you can get some of these products, is making it challenging. So, and then understand that if we do increase the levels of a lot of these alternative feedstuffs, we will potentially have some other negative items, of course, feed conversion being one, but also, for instance, if we feed a high level of distillers grains, we can end up with soft bellies in those pigs. We can see overall reduction in carcass yield when we're feeding a high fiber diet. And then, one other option would also be in ingredients such as distillers grains or wheat midds, particular mycotoxins could be a concern. So just items to think about there. Comparing some of these ingredients, I just wanted to show you in this table. You can see how the NDF or fiber component differs. Soybean hulls is 60% NDF. That's a great source of fiber. But from a cost standpoint, nutritionally, the only thing that hulls are providing really is that fiber. We're not getting any appreciable amount of protein or amino acids or other nutrients, and so that becomes expensive quite quickly. And the amounts that we're needing, really to get to that 20% NDF level, we're probably needing at least 350 or 400 pounds of soybean hulls per ton of diet. If we've got distillers available and we're able to cost it in, we're probably looking at least 700 or 800 pounds per ton of distillers grains to start having an effect on limiting overall energy intake in those animals. Similarly, wheat midds, maybe 650 pounds per ton. Corn germ meal would be another option. That's 44% NDF, but you'd need a fourth of the diet to be corn germ meal. Similarly, if you did have a source of oats and we're able to feed that, oats could be an excellent way to increase bulk density of the diet, but you're going to need about a fourth of the diet to be oats to have a substantial impact on growth rate. And another example would be like dehydrated alfalfa or alfalfa meal. It is actually a very good source of NDF, but it's quite expensive. And you'd need to have it, 550 or 600 pounds per ton of diet to be alfalfa meal. And I think, if you're looking at a product that's costing $500 a ton, for instance, that becomes quite expensive very quickly. So that's some of our challenges on that side of things. Another option that we can have to contribute towards reducing growth rate would be that we decrease our amino acid ratios some, or in particular the lysine to calorie ratio, and then adjust our other amino acids accordingly. We can see or expect to get a 10% reduction in growth if we're drastic enough with decreasing that lysine to calorie ratio. But we're looking at dropping levels by at least 25 or 30% in those scenarios, which might be a little bit too drastic. What would be probably more reasonable would be to moderately reduce our lysine levels. So if we look at our digestible lysine levels, drop them by about 1/10 of a percentage point. That should give us at least a 5% reduction in growth rate, somewhere in that 5 to 10% area. And it's something that can be done either through, us reformulating those diets, or it could simply be that, say you've got pigs that are getting ready to go from your GF4 to your GF5 diet, and you're in a 6-stage grow finish system. You just skip the GF5 and go straight to GF6. That's probably going to be around that 0.08 to 0.1% SID lysine difference. So that's another option too. You will have poor feed conversion. And if we're doing this in late finishing, so if we're putting together a holding diet that's got that 8 or 10% reduction in amino acid level, we will start to see an increase in carcass fat pretty quickly in those pigs. But there also are some things we can do with some other amino acids, in particular tryptophan, where if we reduce that level of tryptophan, we can similarly reduce feed intake and thus slow down growth a little bit also. Couple other dietary options that I would be much more cautious in implementing, simply because we don't have a lot of information and data on them, but they are options. One would be if we can do some things to try to decrease the dietary cation-anion difference, do what we see sometimes on the dairy industry and create metabolic acidosis situation to limit intake. The most likely candidate for this would be calcium chloride, which is essentially ice melt. So think about that. If you're feeding ice melt, what are some negative items that could come from there? Well, obviously it's a salt. It can be very corrosive, so we need to be concerned about that. And it's also very hygroscopic, so it will suck in a lot of moisture. So in particular, as we get into warmer weather here, we may have some issues with feed bridging up and not being able to get out of feed bins. That's a concern. And of course, with the increased salt level, then you'd expect increase in water intake from the pigs. But again, we've got a limited number of trials and experience using this product, but some data would indicate that particularly if we used 4% calcium chloride in the diet, we could increase feed intake by 1/3. If we use half that level, 2%, the data has been much more variable. We'll have much less of an impact or minimal impact, but that's quite a bit of calcium chloride. And if we do consider going down this route, it's much more technical in nature. You need to be working with your nutritionist, with us here at PharmaFeed, because we've got some other things we need to adjust for in the diet. In particular, we're going to have to reduce calcium supplementation that's normally occurring with limestone, because we're adding a lot of calcium into the diet with calcium chloride. And then we still need to maintain the cal-phos ratio. And so we're going to have to do some things ingredient-wise to adjust accordingly so we don't get the calcium to phosphorus ratio too out of whack. Another option would be some unpalatable feed additives. Again, not much data here to base expectations on, but we do know that there are a few ingredients, particularly some bitter compounds such as sodium saccharin, that can decrease intake, but again, very little data. We're not sure how much we can decrease intake, if it's something that would last very long, and so just don't have a lot of information on that topic. In addition to the diets, we can also do some things in our management of the environment to decrease growth rate by decreasing intake in these animals. Of course, one thing is to just manually restrict the amount of feed that the pigs get. The easiest way probably to do that is by tightening our feeders some. Now, we've got some challenges here. We're going to need to be providing quite a bit of extra attention and labor and management if we're trying to do that, or if we're trying to turn feeders on and off to limit the feed intake. And we still have to make sure that we avoid any extended out of feed events. Otherwise, we will see gastric ulcers occurring and or issues with ileitis. So that's kind of the challenge there. Additionally, you can expect to see an increase in fighting and aggressiveness of those pigs as they're trying to fight over the limited amount of feed. Of course, very much expect tail biting to increase. And you're also going to get a significant increase in weight variation among your pigs. Your larger, more bossy pigs are going to fight off the smaller or weaker pigs. And so weight variation disparity will increase that way. So concerns that way. Another option is to try to increase the room temperature in the barn, which is probably going to be done by reducing ventilation in those barns somewhat. And of course, we know that, you know, we can have some pretty significant impacts on decreasing feed intake and growth rate just through increasing temperature. We see it every summer. Estimate that we reduce feed intake by about 1/10 of a pound per day for every 2 degrees that we're above that upper critical temperature in the pig. So for a 200 plus pound pig, you know, anything up above 75 degrees, and of course this is going to also be impacted by other environmental conditions too, flooring, humidity, those kinds of things. But you know, you get up around over 75 degrees, around 80 degrees, we start seeing that heat stress occurring in the latter half of finishing. Also, we'd expect about 1/10 of a pound per day decrease in feed intake for every 10 to 15% increase in humidity in the rooms too. So again, we're going to be adjusting both of those by decreasing ventilation rate, but we need to be cautious, make sure that we don't end up with a situation where we have too much humidity, or if we're not getting rid of gas levels, as that could be a very unsafe situation, not only for the pigs, but for those of us working in the barns. So keep those in mind. And then one other item would be just providing less space allowance per pig, or crowding those pigs in the pens. You know, I think if we do this in a moderate level, we can use this as an effective strategy, but we need to be careful and be mindful of animal well concerns with this, and that we don't get too carried away with crowding pigs. Otherwise, some of these other negative consequences can become a much bigger deal. So as we finish up here, just a couple items that I would not recommend. Certainly if pigs are drinking less water, if they're restricted on water access, that will have a big impact on reducing feed intake and growth. But this is a kind of a slippery slope here. We could, you know, have a large risk here at having some significant animal welfare issues. And so if you were going to decrease the water supply, it'd have to be pretty minimal. And just think about what happens normally in our situations in hot weather in the summer. You know, if we've got an August day, it's early afternoon, we've got all the pigs up and trying to drink water. Well, the pigs that are in the pens closest to where the water comes into the barn, they're getting some water, but if you look at those pens on the other end of the barn, they might not even be getting any water at that point. So even though we might overall restrict water in the barn by 20%, say, well, some pens it might only be a 5 or 10% drop. Other pens might be 50% or greater drop in water intake. So it's again, there's those kinds of challenges that, you know, I think we need to probably look elsewhere. And another concern would be with that restricted water supply, you end up potentially with salt poisoning occurring in these pigs. Which leads me on to one other item that I really wouldn't recommend, is that we reduce salt intake very much. Again, if we do reduce salt, we know we can reduce intake in those pigs, but we're going to have a lot of negative connotations. We're going to have a significant increase in aggressive behaviors, tail biting, flank biting, those kinds of things in the pigs, for what would be maybe a minimal impact on growth rate. So again, that would be kind of risky and not something that I would recommend. So again, just summarize really quickly, you know, we do have some options here we can utilize. I think moderation is a key, and in addition to making sure that you're working with professionals, work with our team here to help make sure that we can do this in a way that we can have some impact on slowing growth rate, but not completely have a whole bunch of other issues go on that would be really challenging, you know. And it probably involves doing a few of these things all at lower levels at the same time, because they will have additive impacts on decreasing growth. But again, it could also have additive impacts on aggressiveness and welfare of the pigs. So that's where my biggest caution with all of this is that we're going to see and be challenged with dealing with aggressiveness of the pigs and tail biting in these pigs much more than we normally would. We certainly do have some strategies to help deal with this. So again, that's why it's important to work with us to try to help alleviate this at least partially. You know, there's things we can do with ingredients, with salt level, mag ox. We have a feed additive called Chomp that, if you're not familiar with, can be very effective with lowering the amount of tail biting that occurs. You know, using items in the pen to distract them, to have them play with versus chewing on their buddies can be available. We're getting very close to having commercially available an edible chew block, a Dura block that would then be like a 40-pound block that could be placed in a pen, and the pigs would be chewing on that. So it'd be providing an option for stereotypic behaviors, but then also is comprised of ingredients and products to help to satiate the pig and reduce some of those aggressive behaviors. So hopefully that'll be available here very soon for folks to have also. So with that being said, I've reached the end of my presentation of the program. I think we could probably, you know, if you want to submit questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. If you scroll your mouse